Assalamualaikum dan selamat pagi. Anda bersama saya Nabilah Khaleeda dan ini Niaga AWANI. Seperti biasa pada jam ini kita akan berikan laporan berita bisnes, kewangan dan juga ekonomi. Jadi kita mulakan dengan perkembangan berikut. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim menegaskan bahawa selatan global seperti BRICS perlu mengambil pendirian berikutan struktur kewangan antarabangsa melalui tabung kewangan antarabangsa IMF dan Pertubuhan Bangsa-Bangsa Bersatu memerlukan pembaharuan. Anwar yang juga Menteri Kewangan berkata, pakatan seperti BRICS adalah penting sebagai mekanisme untuk membincangkan mengenai pembaharuan dan membolehkan semua pihak mendapat manfaatnya.
With BRICS, yes, why not? I mean, the global south have to take a stand because the international financial infrastructure through the IMF needs to reform. United Nations need to reform. We talk about democracy, but we refuse to accept democratic principles and democratic accountability. WTA need to make some adjustments. That's all they were asking for. We're not going to war. We still work under the present mechanisms. So that's why, to me, BRICS is important. At least there's a mechanism we talk, not a zero-sum game. Malaysia is a trading nation. We survive, we manage as a trading nation.
Sesi itu dikendalikan pengasas dan pengurusi Lembaga Pemegang Amanah Forum Ekonomi Dunia WF. Anwar menegaskan bahawa Malaysia adalah sebuah negara perdagangan dan dalam memastikan kesinambungan serta mengurus sebagai negara perdagangan, Malaysia perlu menjalin hubungan baik dengan semua pihak. Beliau berkata Malaysia adalah sebuah negara yang sedang pesat membangun dan sebagai pengerusi ASEAN, perkumpulan itu mempunyai prinsip kepentingan bersama.
We in ASEAN has this principle of centrality. We engage strongly with the United States traditionally. We will continue to do so. China is an important neighbor. We do not have problems. Of course, people highlight the issue of South China Sea, the border. But may I remind you that Malaysia is a maritime country. We have excellent relations with Singapore. We still have border issues with them. We have excellent relations. I treat the Thais as my family members, the leaders. But still we have some border issues with them. So is with Indonesia, with the Philippines. We don't go to war. We don't threaten. We don't have... We do discuss, we get a little angry, but we do focus on the economic fundamentals and move on. And why is it that we must then single out China as an issue? I mean, that's my only contention. Do I have an issue about it? Yes. But do I have a problem? No. Do we have any undesired tensions? No.
Perdana Menteri turut menegaskan bahawa China telah menjadi pemain penting dalam ASEAN dan amat wajar berikutan mereka memberikan komitmen yang tinggi terhadap blok itu. Anwar berkata sebagai sebuah negara yang bebas dan terbuka, Malaysia kini banyak bekerjasama dengan Kesatuan Eropah EU. Beliau berkata Malaysia telah memaklumkan kepada EU bahawa ia perlu bekerjasama dengan Selatan Global dan BRICS. Sementara itu, Ketua Penasihat Kerajaan Bangladesh Profesor Muhammad Yunus berkata ASEAN harus mencipta acuan sendiri dalam pelbagai aspek dan tidak terikut rentak barat. Beliau berkata acuan seperti memaksimumkan keuntungan demi pertumbuhan sudah tidak boleh digunakan. Sebaliknya, pertumbuhan yang boleh diagih kepada rakyat terbanyak adalah acuan terbaik. Selain itu, beliau menekankan pentingnya untuk golongan muda diberikan ruang untuk kehadapan dalam pelbagai sektor sebagai tonggak utama. Beliau turut menegaskan Bangladesh amat berminat untuk menyertai Pakatan ASEAN.
What kind of future that we see for ourselves as a region, as a country? We follow the same footsteps that the West has done as a success and same development paradigm that we have learned. And I'm always saying, no, that's not the way we should do. We should create our own way of what we see as a development, as a future of our countries and so on. One of the things we said, all the issues and definitions and concepts that we have adopted from the Western way of looking at it, can be redesigned. And that's one of the things is the whole banking system, whether banking system should remain connected with the people with money. Can it be redesigned to bring it to people who don't have money, starting with them? And that's what the changes in the microcredit came as a change for that, addressing that, challenging the whole banking system. Banking system has to be redesigned. And that led to us another issue which we want to share with ASEAN. As a part of ASEAN, we will have to work together to make a different kind of society that we have right now, following the same kind of old footsteps that we do. Avoid the whole wealth concentration issue completely, right from the beginning. Because otherwise, if you follow the same step, we go back to the same thing with all the concentration of wealth.
Baik, sebagai pengerusi ASEAN tahun ini, Malaysia menyasar untuk memberi keutamaan kepada tenaga dan ketersambungan dengan tumpuan membina kepercayaan dan keterangkuman dalam kalangan negara anggota. Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim berkata, selain itu perkumpulan tersebut juga akan melibatkan diri secara membina dengan kuasa global utama sambil melindungi kedaulatannya. Beliau berkata keutamaan terhadap sektor tenaga termasuklah bagi grid kuasa ASEAN APG dan teknologi alternatif yang meliputi Indochina, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapura, Indonesia dan Filipina serta melibatkan kabel dasar laut dari Sarawak.
Here, the understanding or the consensus is to focus first on energy, ASEAN energy grid, alternative technology, energy that covers the whole of former Indochina, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines, and including the undersea cable from Sarawak. So which means that sort of a more pragmatic way of resolving not only our economic demands because of the huge interest in data centers being placed, because the requirements for water and electricity is now critical. So we have to address that. At the same time, deal with climate issues, notwithstanding what others think or feel. We in ASEAN feel that this is our priority. This is something which is critical for our future.
Beliau berkata demikian sewaktu menjadi ahli panel pada sesi Forum Ekonomi Dunia WEF 2025 bertajuk ASEAN Even Stronger Together yang dimudahcarakan oleh Presiden WEF Borge Brande. Ahli panel lain termasuklah Perdana Menteri Vietnam Pham Minh Chinh, Duta Khas ke UNSG mengenai Myanmar Julie Bishop, Pengerusi Global Mastercard Michael Maybeck dan Ketua Penasihat Bangladesh Profesor Muhammad Yunus. Mengenai ketersambungan, Anwar berkata tumpuan akan diberikan terutamanya terhadap bidang digital dan kecerdasan buatan AI dalam kalangan negara anggota ASEAN yang akan ditumpukan pada sektor ekonomi.
Of course, there are contending forces. Competing among ourselves, not necessarily so, because we share, and I think there's enough of interest into the region, Malaysia and the region generally being attractive. We are more concerned also about the principle of inclusivity. You have to be sustainable, but you have to be inclusive, which means we do not neglect countries.
Beliau berkata ASEAN cenderung untuk melibatkan diri dan membentuk dasar yang akan menguntungkan satu sama lain bagi memupuk keamanan dan ketenteraman dalam kalangan jiran, contohnya seperti yang dilihat dalam kes Myanmar. Tambahnya, sebagai negara perdagangan, Malaysia dan ASEAN harus terus melibatkan diri menarik pelabur Amerika, Eropah, China, Australia dan India tidak boleh dipaksa untuk menyebelahi mana-mana pihak. Tambahnya, sebagai negara perdagangan, Malaysia dan ASEAN harus terus melibatkan diri menarik pelabur Amerika, Eropah, China, Australia dan India dan tidak boleh dipaksa untuk menyebelahi mana-mana pihak. Ketegangan perdagangan antara dua ekonomi besar akan memberi impak pada negara ekonomi terbuka seperti Malaysia. Menteri Pelaburan, Perdagangan dan Industri MITI Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Tengku Abdul Aziz berkata, Malaysia telah membuat perundingan dengan beberapa pihak termasuk negara rantai bekalan serta mempelbagaikan risiko dalam usaha untuk mengurangkan risiko.
Jelasnya polisi ekonomi ASEAN perlu diperbaiki dengan fokus diberikan terhadap peningkatan perdagangan dan pelaburan antara negara anggota.
Salah satu caranya ialah kita try to de-risk our position by diversification. Itu satu. Yang keduanya dari segi polisi ASEAN itu sendiri. ASEAN seperti disebut tadi sebuah blok ekonomi yang besar, blok ekonomi yang kelima terbesar dalam dunia ini. Tetapi perdagangan di antara negara ASEAN itu masih lagi kecil, 23-24% saja. Itu satu lagi peluang di mana pemimpin-pemimpin ASEAN di bawah kepengurusan ASEAN akan memberi fokus untuk meningkatkan lagi perdagangan dan pelaburan di antara negara-negara ASEAN itu sendiri.
Katanya kewujudan perjanjian rangka kerja ekonomi digital salah satu cara untuk Malaysia dan ASEAN bersedia menerima transformasi digital, namun ia memerlukan penyeragaman bukan sahaja Kementerian Dalam Negara tapi seluruh industri di ASEAN. Menyentuh mengenai aspek kelestarian, Tengku Zafrul berkata perjalanan untuk memenuhi setiap keperluan yang diperlukan masih jauh biarpun negara mempunyai dasar yang komprehensif dan banyak syarikat-syarikat besar serta bertaraf antarabangsa juga sudah bersedia melaksanakannya. Tambahnya lagi, apa yang penting adalah memastikan syarikat-syarikat tempatan, terutama kecil dan sederhana PKS, dapat diberikan garis masa yang sesuai untuk memenuhi syarat yang dikehendaki.
Di sini kita selalu bersuara kerana kita nak transition ini sebuah transition, energy transition ini, sustainable transition kepada kelestarian ini adalah sebuah transition yang adil, yang sama. Dan kita memang end game itu sama. Dan pada masa yang sama kita tidak mahu ini digunakan sebagai non-tarif barrier. Setengah mengatakan kita tak boleh compete dengan negara-negara membangun dan setengah negara membangun juga kata okey, kita letak syarat ini. Dan syarat ini dia tahu kita tak boleh memenuhi, jadi pasarannya protected. Jadi ini salah satu isu yang kita selalu suarakan.
Untuk bersih, Zulian Corporation berhad pada tahun kewangan berakhir 30 November 2024 menyusut pada 23.4 juta ringgit berbanding 29.24 juta ringgit pada tahun sebelumnya kesan perbelanjaan pengguna yang lemah akibat tekanan inflasi. Kumpulan itu berkata hasil bagi tempoh itu juga menyusut kepada 126.2 juta ringgit berbanding 132.4 juta ringgit pada tahun sebelumnya. Terbitan tawaran awam permulaan IPO Northern Solar Holdings Berhad bagi orang awam Malaysia telah terlebih langgan sebanyak 73.2 kali. Syarikat tenaga boleh diperbarui RE itu menerima 25,772 permohonan daripada orang awam Malaysia mewakili langganan bagi 1.47 bilion saham daripada 67.3 juta saham tersedia bernilai 924.59 juta ringgit. Projek perumahan teres setingkat pertama oleh Sime Darby Property Berhad di Bandar Ensdale Arena habis terjual sepenuhnya hanya beberapa jam selepas dilancarkan baru-baru ini. Rumah pegangan bebas itu yang ditawarkan sebanyak 118 unit dengan harga bermula RM420,888 memiliki keluasan binaan antara 1,010 hingga 1,138 kaki persegi. Laporan penuh di saluran 501 dan AstroAwani.com serta Daganus.com. Alright, moving on, the Investment, Trade and Industry Ministry, in collaboration with Industrial Research Institute of Malaysia, SIRIM, will introduce a star rating system for industrial parks next year to ensure they meet acceptable standards. And according to Deputy Minister Liu Chin Tong, the system will evaluate planning and management, infrastructure and business competitiveness, environmental sustainability and social responsibility. So the other question is, could this initiative boost competitiveness, attract global investments and enhance supply chains in key sectors like semiconductors, or are there critical gaps that need to be addressed? So joining us today is Surveyor Sulaiman Sahir, the Director of Research at Rahim & Co International Berhad, to help us unpack the potential challenges and also the opportunities of this ambitious framework. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us this morning, Sulaiman. Perhaps could you briefly explain what the industrial star rating entails and what are the objectives intended within the Malaysian industrial sector, and can you explain the key parameters that the system evaluates and how they impact the overall performance of industrial parks in Malaysia?
Thank you very much. Good morning. The industrial star rating system is planned to be introduced this year. As you mentioned, it's actually a collaboration between MITI, MIDA, as well as SIRIM being the standards authority in the country and internationally recognized as well. So the industrial rating system is actually coined so that it will become a benchmark to ease industrialists, investors and whatnot to actually find out which are the industrial parks that are suitable for their investment intentions. This is actually a good call because this is to actually enhance the competitiveness, as well as making it easy for investors to actually make their appropriate selection for different types of industrial activities, be it E&E or semiconductors or even manufacturing of F&Bs. So this is actually a good call in terms of making it easier for industrial players to actually make an assessment whether a particular industrial park is actually suitable for them. Only thing is, in executing that, the robustness of the system is actually very important, and hence the four angle that's already been announced by the ministry to actually look at the planning and management side, the infrastructure and business side, as well as the social and environmental aspects, which are all very, very important, especially in today's investment and manufacturing environment.
So now that we understand the star rating system for industrial sectors in Malaysia, how would you describe the current state of the Malaysian industrial sector right now? And are there gaps or inefficiencies that industrial star rating is aiming to address, perhaps in infrastructure and also business competitiveness in Malaysian industrial parks, for example?
The industrial sector in Malaysia has been performing very encouragingly, especially in the past few years. Industrial sector has been one of the darling sectors between the different types of property sectors. I guess the growth of e-commerce brought by the influence of the pandemic onto consumer behaviors, the logistics sector, as well as now with the digitalization age, the growth of data centers. There's been a lot of interest within the industrial sector. Mind you, total industrial property transactions, just to make a comparison, only accounts to about 2% of the total transactions in the country, but the value that it comes up to a total of 12% or so to the total value of property transactions, which is actually very significant. In terms of how the rating system, how does it actually fill in the gaps? With the rating system, if we can imagine, from the My Site selection portal that's already been launched by the ministry, it sets like a guide for investors, having some very useful information in terms of the location, in terms of the supply chain, what are the manufacturers or people within the same industry which are congregated within a location, and the catchment for labor pool, institutional support, and the business support as well. So for the gap that can be actually identified here is through the rating system, we can actually identify to make sure, which is actually the intention of the ministry, to make sure that all our industrial parks are actually up to mark, all are actually within a strong point system so that it is continuously being competitive, not just locally, but globally as well. And that rating system, there could be some that are actually going to score high, and there'll be some who are actually still within the challenging period or still growing period. And this is where by putting all these parameters in place, it quantifies and it makes it easy for us to identify what elements needs to be improved, whether it is going to be on the business support system or the supply chain or the infrastructure angle, or even the accommodation facilities and the amenities that are crucial to an industrial park.
But that's the pros of it. We can help to identify the differences of each industrial parks. But how do you think the star rating system might affect the competitiveness of Malaysian industrial parks on both domestic and global scale, like I mentioned earlier? And how do you think it will impact the supply chain resilience for various industries in Malaysia, including strategic sectors like semiconductors, perhaps?
With any rating system or even an assessment, there will be some who are actually going to actually pass the mark or basically having a high rating, and some that will be identified having some challenging performances. It is going to be a wake-up call to some of those, but these are also giving opportunities for them to actually identify the weaknesses for them to actually improve. But one challenge in terms of getting this rating system in place is to get the buy-in of the investors. So the stakeholders' engagement and the methodology, the robustness of the assessment system, which has to be looked at from different angles, be it from the developers' angle, from the regulators' angle, the tenants' angle, the operators' angle, as well as the workforce within the whole ecosystem. Because the industrial rating system should be, and has actually been suggested already, it should be robust enough to look at the different angles, from the environmental side, from the social side, from the economic side, from the technological side, as well as regulatory compliance side as well.
But in your opinion, Sulaiman, what are the key success factors or risks in implementing the star rating system effectively across the diverse industrial landscape of Malaysia? And what measures should be taken to ensure the transparency and also accuracy of the industrial star rating system evaluations?
One challenge is because this is actually a new system that's going to be introduced in a landscape of the industrial market in Malaysia, which has been, for years, it has been in place. There are industrial estates or industrial parks in the country that are 40 years old, 50 years old. And these are maybe located in an area that does not have that as strong of a new infrastructure, the digital infrastructure especially. And in terms of the services, the waste management, for example, is one angle. So in terms of doing this, one challenge is to identify a method or a matrix to make this assessment that can actually delineate the differences. Because it is not going to be fair from one angle to actually have an old industrial park which is actually working optimally within its constraints and putting it at a low rating, whereas a new industrial park that's actually going to be much better equipped and whatnot, and having a higher star rating. But here again, it be differentiated by different category or different classes of industrial parks, age maybe, as well as location. You can imagine within the major industrial states like Selangor, Penang, Johor, the infrastructure, or even Kedah for that matter, the infrastructure is going to be different compared to some of the other states or some of the areas that are within the rural areas or semi-rural areas.
Perhaps before we end this discussion, Sulaiman, last question. Have similar systems been implemented in other countries? And in your opinion, what lessons can Malaysia learn from their successes or failures?
Yes, it has actually been. It is actually a system that's already deployed in India, for example. It has its own industrial star rating system in India. And there's some other countries as well, in Germany, in Korea, even in China, but it's of a different angle. It goes focused on the technological. Some of it actually more technologically focused. Some of it are more green focused. Some of it are actually more environmental focused. But over here, in terms of the overall consensus for the different prong approach, there are, as a matter of fact, UNIDO, United Nations Industrial Development Organization, have actually come up with a guideline for industrial parks. And these are actually going to be quantified and correlated so that it can be used for international investors to hopefully actually come and see how easy is it to find industrial properties in the country, and making it they're more conversant and confident because the information is forthcoming through a more transparent and veracity system.
All right, I would like to say thank you so much to Surveyor Sulaiman Sahir, the Director of Research, Rahim and Co-Engineer Senior Berhad, for your insights and for your time as well this morning. And I hope to see you next week, the same time. And we have a lot more updates after this. We'll be right back.
Thank you.
RHB Islamic Bank Berhad RHB menyediakan kemudahan pembiayaan bernilai RM133.5 juta kepada Tenaga Nasional Berhad TNB untuk menyokong pembangunan ladang solar 29.99 megawatt di Kulim, Kedah sebagai sebahagian daripada usaha untuk memajukan matlamat tenaga boleh diperbaharui Malaysia. Pengarah urusan RHB Islamic Bank Dato' Adi Sadikin Ali berkata, perjanjian berkenaan menekankan peranan penting kerjasama strategik dalam mempercepatkan perubahan dan memajukan agenda tenaga boleh diperbaharui di Malaysia. Petroleum Nasional Berhad Petronas terus menunjukkan daya tahan dengan memperoleh tempat 160 daripada 500 jenama paling berharga dunia, kata firma penilaian jenama Global Brand Finance. Firma tersebut melaporkan nilai jenama minyak dan gas Malaysia dalam ranking global menurun 1% kepada $14.4 bilion Amerika. Pengambil alihan AR Mall Seri Manjung diperak oleh Sunway Real Estate Investment Trust REIT diramal memacu pendapatan hartanah bersih NPI sebanyak RM636 juta. M Investment juga optimis terhadap pendapatan pengagihan Sunway REIT yang dijangka naik 0.9% kepada RM417 juta dibantu oleh pengembalian sewa. Laporan penuh di saluran 501 dan Astro AWANI.com serta Neganus.com.
Seterusnya, delegasi Malaysia menutup tirai lawatan ke Davos, Switzerland sempena Forum Ekonomi Dunia 2025. Naratif ASEAN diangkat secara besar di pentas global itu selain usaha membuka pintu untuk pelaburan dan perdagangan dengan negara luar. Editor kanan Astro Najib Aroff ada rangkumannya.
Lawatan delegasi Malaysia ke World Economic Forum sudah pun melaburkan tirai dan sudah pasti naratif yang kita ingin bawakan dalam konteks ASEAN, ekonomi Malaysia dan juga kefahaman yang ingin kita bawakan dan juga cerahkan kepada semua delegasi yang hadir di World Economic Forum sudah pun kita jelaskan. Bagaimana pencapaian ini dan juga keadaannya untuk kita nilai skalanya dan juga bagaimana ini boleh membuka ruang lebih luas dalam konteks kerjasama antara ASEAN, Malaysia dan juga negara di rantau di Eropah maupun negara-negara barat masuk Amerika Syarikat. Saya bersama dengan saudara Amir sekali lagi, Amir Farid Rahim. Saya nak terus saja kepada ulasan kita. Perdana Menteri, delegasi semua sudah pun wrap up lawatan dan sebagainya. Satu adalah naratif ASEAN yang dibawa ke sini. Bagaimana pada sudut pandangan saudara Amir sendiri melihat bahawa kejayaan naratif itu diangkat? Adakah sudah cukup faham delegasi di sini? Kerana ada yang bertanyakan, adakah ASEAN akan menjadi seperti EU? Sedangkan nyata perbezaan ASEAN antara ASEAN dan EU tu.
Terima kasih Najib. Itulah salah satu kelebihan World Economic Forum ni kerana dapat mengumpulkan semua pemimpin dari seluruh penusuk dunia, bukan saja dari segi konteks barat dan timur tetapi juga negara-negara Afrika dan negara-negara Eropah penting ni, dan mereka tidak semestinya tahu. Kalau kita bincangkan soal Malaysia, Malaysia ini kalau mereka kepada pengamat yang di luar sana mungkin tidak begitu memberi perhatian kepada kita kerana Malaysia ini dari segi saiz ekonomi kita bersaiz sederhana, kita di dalam hanya top 35, kita dalam segi competitiveness pun kita top 30. Jadi di ASEAN juga kita ni kita besar tapi kita mid table lah dari segi sudut ukur yang lain. Jadi apabila kita berada di platform seperti ini, bukan saja delegasi Malaysia memberi pencerahan tentang polisi hala tuju Malaysia tetapi juga membawakan naratif sebagai pengerusi ASEAN. Kerana sebagaimana yang kita kata, Malaysia itu okey dari segi sudut makroekonominya dalam 2-3 tahun kebelakangan ini dilihat agak baik. Inflasi, kadar inflasi di bawah 2%, kadar pengangguran di bawah lebih kurang 3%, pertumbuhan 5.2 mungkin ya untuk tahun 52-53 untuk 2024. Jadi dari segi makronya baik. Untuk menjadi pengerusi ASEAN ini, kalau ekonomi domestik stabil, jadi orang lebih akan memandang kepada kita sebagai pengerusi ASEAN. Jadi apa yang pentingnya ialah untuk juga menjual potensi ASEAN itu. Sememangnya kita mahu memposisikan Malaysia sebagai pintu masuk utama ASEAN. Jadi saya rasa dari segi agenda itu, saya rasa amat berjaya sekali delegasi Malaysia kali ini. Kedua ialah mempertahankan bahawa ASEAN itu adalah satu zon, satu gabungan yang neutral. Okey, ini kita mungkin tidak begitu peka kalau di peringkat domestik, tetapi di mana-mana forum-forum antarabangsa sering pemimpin-pemimpin dari Malaysia, baik dari kerajaan maupun dari korporat, akan ditanya tentang isu adakah dalam persaingan antara dua kuasa besar iaitu US dan China, Amerika dan China, bagaimanakah adakah Malaysia akan terus neutral atau akan ditarik ke satu pihak yang lain. Tapi Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim telah menjelaskan beberapa kali bahawa kekuatan ASEAN itu dan kekuatan Malaysia itu adalah untuk kekal neutral, tetapi neutral dalam konteks berhubung, engage dengan semua pihak, ya.
Saya nak tanya soalan kepada apa yang disentuh ataupun ditanyakan kepada Perdana Menteri dalam sesi conversation with Datuk Seri Ibrahim, iaitu berkaitan dengan BRICS. Persoalan penyertaan Malaysia sebagai negara rakan kepada BRICS itu sendiri. Dan jawapan Perdana Menteri itu sangat menarik kerana beliau menyatakan bahawa sebenarnya banyak badan di peringkat antarabangsa ini sudah kena reformasi itu kerana sudah mungkin ada permasalahan yang wujud dalam badan tersebut. Beliau nyatakan seperti IMF dan beberapa badan yang lain. Bagaimana kita membaca bahawa naratif kita sertai BRICS itu adalah kita faham realiti sudah berubah dan mereka juga faham bahawa Malaysia bukan seperti negara yang hanya ikut telunjuk barat sahaja acuan itu, tapi kita ada pendirian kita dan juga kita tahu ke mana visi kita.
Ya, saya rasa penting di dalam keadaan dunia yang mempunyai pelbagai konflik geopolitik untuk Malaysia kekal menganggotai pelbagai forum untuk menyuarakan pendapat kita. Jadi apa yang disentuh oleh Datuk Seri Anwar mengatakan bahawa perlu ada reformasi badan-badan dunia ini, saya rasa benar. Kerana kalau kita lihat kepada pertubuhan-pertubuhan antarabangsa, apabila mereka menjadi organisasi yang besar di peringkat dunia, mereka tidak lagi mereka terlalu saya rasa obses dengan masalah-masalah dalaman, masalah-masalah birokrasi. Jadi tidak dapat membantu memperjuangkan matlamat asal institusi ini. Jadi pada badan antarabangsa juga ini kita tidak boleh blame sesiapa, tapi akan mengikut telunjuk kuasa yang mendanai mereka, itu negara-negara yang besar ini. Jadi di mana letaknya negara-negara kecil dan bersaing sederhana seperti Malaysia? Jadi kerana itulah saya rasa kerajaan, dasar ekonomi dan dasar hubungan luar kerajaan memperbanyakkan platform untuk Malaysia mengangkat suara dan naratif kita sebagai kuasa yang bersaing sederhana tetapi mempunyai outlook yang antarabangsa global untuk memastikan bahawa ekonomi kita kekal berdaya saing. Saya rasa itu key-nya, menganggotai untuk kepentingan ekonomi kita lebih daripada kepentingan geopolitik, tapi geoekonomi.
Ya, keterbukaan kita itu dalam soal perdagangan itu juga penting. Antara soalan berkaitan perdagangan ini adalah ada yang bertanyakan soal pendirian ASEAN dalam konteks China sebagai contoh. Ini sangat menarik sebab kita tahu kita negara berdagang, rantau yang berdagang dan kita terbuka untuk berdagang dengan Amerika Syarikat dan juga China. Ini pendirian kita. Tapi kefahaman di World Economic Forum yang kebanyakannya adalah Eurocentric, berpaksikan Eropah ini, mungkin mereka menganggap bahawa pendirian itu tidak ada di ASEAN ataupun Malaysia sendiri. Bagaimana?
Saya setuju sangat dengan assessment Najib. Itu mereka tak faham konsep neutral ni bagaimana. Kerana mereka saya rasa melihat dunia dari sudut yang begitu bipolar, hitam atau putih, bersama Amerika atau bersama dengan China. Tapi kita tidak boleh, masalah isu kita di ASEAN, kita berkawan dengan semua orang. ASEAN, China itulah rakan dagang ASEAN yang terbesar. Ya, bukan saja rakan dagangan Malaysia yang terbesar, tapi dari keseluruhan rantau ialah rakan dagangan terbesar. Tapi pada masa yang sama, Amerika juga adalah di antara top 5 rakan dagang kita. Dan untuk Malaysia, Amerika sendiri adalah rakan pelaburan sumber FDI yang utama untuk Malaysia. Jadi kita tidak boleh melihat dunia ini dari segi hitam putih bersama dengan satu pihak atau melawan satu pihak yang lain, ya. Tapi pemahaman ini memerlukan penjelasan yang berterusan oleh pemimpin-pemimpin bukan saja dari Malaysia, bahkan dari seluruh ASEAN, untuk memastikan bahawa rakan-rakan sejawat mereka, rakan-rakan dan komuniti pelaburan di Eropah, di Amerika faham tentang kedudukan kita. Saya rasa dari segi korporat, dari segi syarikat-syarikat yang berada di dalam rantaian supply chain global ini, mereka faham position kita, mereka faham neutrality kita dan the appeal of ASEAN. Tetapi pentadbiran kerajaan-kerajaan mereka, contohnya kerajaan Amerika, mungkin merasa sangsi. Jadi kerana itu pencerahan itu amat penting. Walaupun kita berkata dari segi diplomasi, mungkin ada yang mengambil remeh. Contohnya dalam ASEAN ini, pada tahun ini kita mempengerusikan ASEAN, kita dapat melihat mungkin ada lebih 200 mesyuarat dalam ASEAN di pelbagai peringkat. Mesyuarat inilah yang menjamin keamanan dan kestabilan kita. Mungkin dari segi momentum pergerakan sesuatu isu mungkin agak slow, lembab sedikit. Tetapi asalkan kita terus berjumpa antara negara-negara ASEAN, kerana kita ambil mudah ini. ASEAN kalau kita lihat satu market 680 juta populasinya, pelbagai sistem di dalam ASEAN ini, pelbagai majoriti agama di setiap negara kita. Contohnya di Malaysia kita Muslim majority, Indonesia Muslim majority, Christian majority, Thai, Buddhis. Sistem ada yang demokrasi seperti kita, Indonesia, Filipina, Singapura. Ada yang sistem pentadbirannya monarki, Brunei. Ada pelbagai rancang sistem yang lain. Tetapi kita dapat memastikan kita masih berbincang antara satu sama lain, dan ini yang memastikan keamanan yang menjana kestabilan buat rantau ini. Bila kita stabil, kedudukan ekonomi kita akan bertambah baik.
Okey.
Kerana saya tambah lagi, dari segi ASEAN bertumbuh 4 hingga 5% setiap tahun for the last 10 years. Zon ekonomi mana lagi yang mempunyai pertumbuhan yang serancang itu?
Ya. Dan sudah pasti salah satu fokus juga adalah bagaimana Menteri MITI sendiri, Tengku Dato' Sri Zafrul, membawa naratif soal menarik masuk pelaburan bukan saja kepada ASEAN, kepada Malaysia. Dalam trip sebelum ini ke London, ke Brussels, ke UAE dan sebagainya. Dan kali ini di World Economic Forum, bagaimana untuk melihat bahawa kefahaman mereka, keterbukaan negara-negara barat, negara Eropah terhadap Malaysia, terhadap ASEAN dalam konteks pelaburan dan juga perkara lain.
Terima kasih Najib. Dari segi pelaburan, misi pelaburan dan juga perdagangan, ada two parts, ya. Saya rasa MITI meneruskan usaha sebelum ini, masih konsisten untuk mempromosi dan positioning Malaysia ini di mata dunia. Saya rasa kita sendiri dapat melihat dari bukti yang kukuh dengan kemasukan pelaburan, nilai pelaburan yang tinggi tahun 2024 dan juga tahun 2023. Jadi saya rasa momentum ini akan dapat dipertingkatkan lagi dengan kepengurusian ASEAN oleh Malaysia pada tahun ini. Jadi kita harus mencari, tetapi pada pandangan yang sama, pihak kerajaan harus memastikan bahawa manfaat itu dapat dirasai oleh syarikat-syarikat Malaysia, bukan sahaja syarikat yang besar, tetapi juga syarikat-syarikat PMKS dapat merasa masuk dalam rantaian bekalan ASEAN ini. Jadi dari segi mencari pelaburan, kita juga harus memastikan bahawa kerajaan terus mencari pelaburan yang berkualiti. Okey. Apa yang dimaksudkan berkualiti bukan sahaja dari sudut kelestarian, memerlukan green investment untuk masa hadapan, tetapi juga pelaburan-pelaburan yang mempunyai manfaat yang besar dari segi spillover impact kepada real economy di Malaysia. Juga bila kita bercakap tentang pelaburan yang berkualiti ini, saya rasa dalam keadaan ketegangan hubungan antara US dan China, perlu juga berhati-hati dengan pelaburan-pelaburan yang mungkin boleh mengundang sekatan ekonomi sebagainya kerana hubungan perdagangan ini. Jadi saya rasa dari segi momentum Malaysia itu memang ada, dan kalau kita berbincang tentang kefahaman tentang Malaysia di World Economic Forum ini, saya rasa tahun ini lebih jelas. Jadi di dalam mesyuarat-mesyuarat yang kita hadiri yang saya hadiri sepanjang minggu ini, apabila bercakap tentang Malaysia aja, kebanyakan daripada rakan-rakan kita dari Eropah dan Amerika boleh point out kepada kita, you've attracted a lot of data centers recently. So you're the data center hub, pusat pengkalan data, hub pusat pengkalan data di Asia Tenggara. Jadi saya rasa itu satu yang positif. Yeah. Kita sudah diketahui, dikenali berjaya mampu menarik pelaburan-pelaburan besar. Ini kerana kestabilan politik dan ekonomi Malaysia buat masa ini, dan momentum pertumbuhan ekonomi yang saya rasa agak baik. Jadi dari segi pelaburan, data center adalah satu catalyst yang membuka mata komuniti global, tapi perlu juga ditekankan, kerajaan perlu menekankan bahawa kita perlu, kerana data center ini ada baik dan ada buruknya. Menggunakan sumber tenaga yang begitu banyak, walaupun ada komponen yang harus menggunakan sumber hijau, ya, renewable energy. Jadi kita perlu memastikan ada diversifikasi dari segi mendapatkan pelaburan berkualiti. Jangan hanya bertumpu pada data center saja, kerana ialah memanglah kita berada di dalam ledakan AI. Demand, permintaan untuk data dan pusat untuk storage data itu akan bertambah. Tetapi industri-industri lain juga harus diberi penekanan oleh kerajaan untuk memastikan daya saing Malaysia itu terus meningkat dari tahun ke tahun.
Okey, Saudara Amir, terima kasih kerana bersama dengan AWANI pada jam ini untuk kita melihat kepada report sedikit delegasi Malaysia telah pun menamatkan misi mereka di World Economic Forum. Sekian sahaja laporan saya. Ada beberapa laporan lagi yang saya akan bawakan, dan juga anda boleh ikuti di laman web kami astro.com.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Cara kita mendapat berita kian berubah. Melalui media sosial maupun saluran digital yang lain serta kaca TV. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini.
Kita buat sesuatu yang berbeza.
Berteraskan acuan verifikasi yang diamalkan supaya setiap fakta adalah sahih. Daripada analisis pelbagai sudut yang mendalam, laporan-laporan khas dan perbincangan yang membina negara. Inklusif, suara rakyat kami ajukan. Keseimbangan persepsi kami pastikan. Kerana setiap cerita mempunyai impak yang tersendiri dan perlu dibawa dengan penelitian yang terperinci. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda, tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada. Saluran berita paling dipercayai di Malaysia.
Baik, dalam segmen ini kita akan beri tumpuan khusus kepada dunia perekaan, dunia fashion, dan dalam episod kali ini kita akan beri kepada dunia rekaan sulaman yang unik dan eksklusif dari Hana Rauda. Antara sebuah jenama yang telah mencuri perhatian sejak penubuhannya pada tahun 2016, dan kita tahu dalam dunia fashion perekaan yang semakin kompetitif, kita nak meliti bagaimanakah jenama Hana Rauda ini sendiri, apa keistimewaan dia, apakah daya tarikan selain daripada jenama-jenama lain. Dan kita akan bawakan pengurus pemasaran dan jualan Hana Rauda sendiri merupakan ahli Ati Razanuddin. Saya nak ucapkan terima kasih kerana sudi meluangkan masa bersama kami. Apabila kita bercakap mengenai jenama ini, kita sudah tahu apa antara kita lihat rekaan ataupun fashion sense dia. Tetapi mungkin boleh kongsikan dulu bagaimana penubuhan jenama Hana Rauda itu sendiri. Apakah yang inspire you untuk membangunkan jenama ini?
Okey, sebenarnya Hana Rauda ni dia bermula daripada 2016. Pada permulaan tu kita hanya mengambil tempahan baju customer sahaja. Tetapi lama kelamaan kita upgrade kita punya mesin, sulam semua untuk kita buat pasaran besar. Ready to wear kita panggil. Di situ kita bagi keistimewaan kepada pelanggan kita untuk mengubah suai sulaman, sizing, bentuk badan. Sebab kat Hana Rauda ni kita tekankan customer kena pakai baju ngam dengan badan cantik selesa. Sebab tu tak semua orang boleh pakai baju size S, kain size S. Ada orang pakai baju size S, kain size M. Jadi dekat Hana Rauda ni dia boleh buat. Kita boleh tukar tanpa mengambil masa yang lama sebab kita mempunyai mesin dan tenaga kerja yang ramai. Dari situ kita berkembang, pergi ke digital, pergi ke macam sekarang ni kita akan buka booth macam tu. Kita membesar dari sikit demi sedikit lah.
Okey, mungkin boleh kongsilah tenaga kerja apabila mula perniagaan ini berapa dan sehinggalah sekarang dah berapa orang dah?
Waktu awal-awal tu saya tak berapa nak ingat. Mungkin bawah 10 untuk Hana Rauda sendiri, tetapi sekarang ni kita dah berkembang menjadikan dalam 30 tenaga kerja.
Dua kali ganda tu. Dan kita nak lihat bagaimanakah pencapaian ataupun langkah-langkah yang telah dilakukan oleh Hana Rauda sendiri untuk teroka ruang perniagaan digital. Seperti kalau kita lihat sekarang ada banyak TikTok shop, kita pergi ke Shopee. Dan kalau kita lihat bagaimanakah mengintegrasikan platform digital ni dalam mempromosi jualan-jualan ini.
Betul, zaman sekarang ni kebanyakannya di alam maya. Betul. Kita daripada butik kita kena berkembang seiring dengan zaman dengan memperkuatkan lagi kita punya social media. Hana Rauda ni dia aktif dekat social media seperti Shopee, TikTok, Instagram. Dekat social media tu kita dapat mempamerkan hasil seni kita dan berinteraksi dengan pelanggan di seluruh dunia. Salah satu strategi yang Hana Rauda gunakan iaitu berkolaborasi dengan Insta-famous, dengan influencer yang sangat popular dalam bidang fashion dan juga bidang seni. Dari situlah kita boleh menjangkau lebih ramai lagi peminat Hana Rauda yang ingin mengetahui lebih dekat siapa tu Hana Rauda.
Macam mana Hana Rauda ni menggunakan platform digital untuk tarik pelanggan-pelanggan dari luar negara untuk pastikan nama ataupun jenama ini dikenali di peringkat global?
Selalunya kita bermula dengan mempromosikan kita punya video, kita punya konten-konten yang bermanfaat dan juga berkualiti supaya konten tu boleh pergi jauh dan boleh menembusi luar daripada Malaysia ini. Kita juga dah ada customer, pelanggan-pelanggan di luar Malaysia seperti di Brunei, Indonesia dan juga paling jauh kita pernah ada di USA.
Kalau kita nak lihat dalam pasaran fashion pun ni kira kompetitif. Kita ada banyak juga persaingan dengan pelbagai produk, jenama, rekaan, sulaman yang telah diwujudkan pada ketika ini. Jadi kalau kita lihat dalam bidang fashion industry ketika ini, apakah antara common challenges, cabaran, kita boleh cakap kekangan, dan bagaimana Hana Rauda sendiri mengatasi setiap cabaran dan halangan itu?
Okey, kalau nak lihat cabaran zaman sekarang ni memang sangat kompetitif. Kita punya bidang fashion ni dia bergerak sangat cepat. So kita perlu mengadaptasinya seiring dengan zaman. Banyak jenama dekat luar sana buat sulam juga. Apa beza dengan Hana Rauda, betul tak? Jadi apa yang membezakannya Hana Rauda ni, dia ada kilang dan mesin sulam sendiri dekat HQ kita di Kuang. Jadi kalau customer nak order, kita boleh buat dengan segera tanpa mengambil masa yang lama. Dia tak perlu tunggu custom made berbulan-bulan. Kalau macam nak tukar warna sulam, design sulam tu, kita boleh buat hanya dalam 5 ke 7 hari bekerja. Jadi bila kita memperoleh customer yang banyak macam tu, apa yang menyebabkan cabaran tu adalah kita perlu menyediakan mesin sulam berkomputer yang berkualiti, canggih, yang banyak. Dan juga dengan tenaga kerja untuk memastikan sulaman order customer tu siap dalam masa yang ditetapkan. Itu adalah salah satu cabaran, dan saya rasa cabaran yang seterusnya dia memerlukan kos yang sangat besar. Bila kita nak beli mesin sulam sendiri, kita nak mengambil pekerja yang profesional, dia memerlukan kos yang sangat besar. Itulah yang kita hadapi sekarang ni.
Dan kita juga mahu memahami kenapa sulaman masih menjadi trend dan pilihan sehingga kini dalam kalangan masyarakat. Kerana kita tahu bukan mudah untuk membangunkan jenama selepas sedekat. Kerana banyak perkara ataupun risiko-risiko yang perlu kita pertimbangkan daripada segi kos, logistik dan tenaga kerja. Jadi bagaimana untuk kita meneliti perkara-perkara ini diambil kira dalam memastikan sulaman ini masih memikat hati rakyat ataupun pelanggan.
Okey, sulaman ni dia masih lagi mekar di kalangan pengguna pelanggan kita. Sebab apa? Sebab dekat Hana Raudah sendiri kita menggabungkan konsep modern kontemporari dan juga klasik, sulaman yang klasik. Jadi customer dia boleh pilih nak bunga tu macam mana, nak susunan atau bunga tu macam mana. So sulaman tu dia akan jadi sangat unik dan dia menepati cita rasa pelanggan tu sendiri. Sebab tu saya rasa sulaman ni dia tak akan hilang lah dek zaman, kerana kita boleh improvise sendiri benda tu.
Mungkin boleh kongsilah sedikit apakah antara koleksi terbaru yang dibawakan oleh Hana Raudah untuk Raya tahun 2025. Kalau kita tengok sekarang ni mungkin dah ramai dah tukar, belum puasa lagi dah tukar. Mungkin boleh kongsikan sikit.
Okey, untuk Raya tahun 2025 ni kita mengambil langkah yang lain sikit dengan menggunakan bahan yang bertekstur dan juga bahan yang bercorak, berfloral lah macam tu, tapi kita masih lagi mengetengahkan konsep sulam. Kita nak tunjuk, Hana Raudah ni nak tunjuk bahawa dengan menggunakan material yang bertekstur ataupun bersulam juga, kita boleh naikkan dia dengan seri sulaman tersebut. Jadi kalau nak cuba, kena try lah Hana Raudah punya baju.
Tapi kalau orang macam pelanggan baru mahu membeli Hana Raudah, apakah antara kita boleh cakap desain-desain yang lain pada tahun ini, dan adakah diterapkan elemen-elemen baru untuk memenuhi keperluan moden ni macam mana?
Betul. Kalau dalam Raya punya koleksi, kita masih mengekalkan sulaman yang klasik, tetapi kita mengambil berat dengan campuran moden kontemporari, seperti butang aksesori, seperti kain yang bercorak moden. Macam itulah kita campurkan contemporary punya look dengan klasik punya look.
Jadi untuk pelanggan di luar sana macam mana, ataupun kita boleh cakap lokasi-lokasi di center-center mana untuk dapatkan produk-produk ataupun koleksi Hana Raudah selepas ini?
Okey, Hana Raudah dia ada 3 butik sebenarnya. Di HQ kita Kuang Rawang, di Sungai Buloh dan juga di Bangi Central. Tapi kalau siapa yang duduk jauh daripada situ, bolehlah ke website kami www.hanaraudah.com ataupun Instagram, Shopee, TikTok Hana Raudah Official.
Okey, mungkin saya nak tambah lagi satu, Alia.
Okey.
Untuk anak-anak muda yang mendengar perbincangan dan perbualan kita ini mengenai perniagaan Hana Raudah daripada permulaan sehinggalah kini, kita meneliti daripada segi cabaran peluang yang diambil daripada platform tradisional kepada digital, dan mungkin anak-anak muda di luar sana yang minat untuk memasuki bidang sulaman ini. Apakah nasihat dan harapan yang boleh diberikan mereka, terutama yang mungkin takut ataupun mahu menjadikan perniagaan sulaman ini sebagai perniagaan pertama mereka?
Untuk nak jadikan sulaman ni sebagai perniagaan pertama, salah satu kena ada ilmu sulaman tu sendiri. Macam saya ada mentor saya, iaitu ibu mertua saya. Dialah yang buat sulam ni semuanya. So kalau nak berniaga, kena ada mentor, kena ada cikgu. Dan juga jangan takut untuk teruskan. Walaupun rasa susah, walaupun rasa macam tak gagal, boleh pergi, gagal, ramainya orang, banyaknya pesaing, tak apa, cuba dulu. Kalau kita tak cuba, kita tak tahu.
Betul. Walaupun kita jatuh tapi kita kena bangkit lagi tinggi. Di mana ada kemauan, di situ ada jalannya. Okey, sekali lagi saya nak ucapkan terima kasih atas perkongsian ini kepada pengurus pemasaran dan jualan Hana Rauda Alia Atira Zainuddin, dan untuk anda di luar sana ingin dapatkan perbincangan penuh bersama Puan Alia dan apakah antara koleksi-koleksi, anda boleh pergi ke websitenya, dan setiap perbincangan ini akan kami rangkumkan dalam astroawani.com dan di semua platform digital Astro Awani.
Kementerian Dalam Negeri memberi lampu hijau supaya pengesanan dadah dilakukan terhadap pengguna web.
Tahap integriti warga polis di Raja Malaysia PDRM masih membimbangkan walaupun peringatan dan amaran diberikan berulang kali.
Anwar menegaskan bahawa negara ini tidak mengiktiraf Israel secara de jure meskipun keberadaan negara itu di peringkat antarabangsa.
Malaysia tidak akan meminda peta sempadan maritim dan tetap mempertahankan kawasan dan kedaulatan negara di Laut Cina Selatan.
You janji takkan tinggalkan I kan?
Sumpah, I takkan tinggalkan you.
Nafsu menguasai akal.
Awak betul-betul nak tinggalkan keluarga ni?
Bukan keluarga ni, tapi perkahwinan ni.
Runtuhnya sebuah mahligai.
Yang tak guna! Gila ke? Dia sanggup tinggalkan kami semua sebab perempuan tu.
Boleh abang kepau tangan depan semua orang? Mana harga diri abang sebagai seorang suami?
Ya! Jurang tanpa niat, Isnin hingga Kamis di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
Asia tumpuan utama dunia. Dengan ekonomi yang semakin rancak, pembangunan lestari dan tenaga boleh diperbaharui, apakah pula impak kecerdasan buatan AI dalam perkembangan teknologi dan masa depan pekerjaan? Kami mendalami setiap berita dan cerita. Saksikan diskusi, dialog dan laporan khas di Agenda Awani Asia bersama koresponden khas kami setiap Sabtu 9 malam di semua platform Astro Awani.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the briefing on the Chief Economist's Outlook 2025 and our discussion on where the global economy is headed this year and what leaders and policymakers can expect from the next 12 months. The Chief Economist's Outlook has been published a couple of days ago here in Davos, and it's the result of a survey of around 50 economists, both from public and private institutions, and 3 of them are sitting here with me on stage today. We have Fernando Honorato Barbosa, Chief Economist of the Banco Bradesco from Brazil. We have Karen Harris. She is Managing Director of the Macro Trends Group from Bain & Company. Welcome. And we have Gilles Moek, Chief Economist of AXA Investment from the UK. Welcome. So before we start our discussion here on stage, a very quick remark to our online audience. If you want to share ideas we discuss here on stage or numbers from the report, please do that, but use the handle and the hashtag WEF25. Now, to get the discussion going, let's briefly look at the most important findings from the report. The outlook for the global economy in 2025 remains weak, with many downside risks. I think that's not a big surprise. 56% of the chief economists expect conditions to even weaken over the next year. Only 17% foresee an improvement, so very little space for optimism. And main reason for this outlook is the increasing uncertainty all over the world. The IMF has delivered the numbers. A couple of days ago, the global economy will expand by 3.2% this year. That's basically unchanged from 2024. And that will slow to 3.1% over the next 5 years. But we also see a very significant divergence, regional divergence. This is what we are going to discuss here in a minute. A very good outlook for the United States. 44% of the economists predict strong growth for 2025, compared to only 15% in the last survey. So that's a big jump. South Asia is also expected to maintain strong growth, and here are all eyes on India. For many other regions, the economists are less optimistic, and this is what you can hear in Davos in many discussions already. Europe ranks as one of the weakest regions. 70%, 74% even, of the economists expect weak or very weak growth for Europe, and this would be the third slow year in a row. In Germany, we would say Europe has the rote Laterne, which is carrying the red lantern. Also weak, the outlook for China, and growth is projected to even slow down in China for the next couple of years. Quick look to inflation. Global inflation is easing. IMF projects an annual average of 4.3% in 25, down from 5.8% in 24. However, services inflation remain higher than good inflations, especially a topic we are going to talk about in a second. So these are the main facts. Now let's turn to our esteemed panel here today. So what are your expectations? Maybe let's start with you, Fernando.
Okay, no, fantastic. So thank you very much. Thank you for the audience. Let's say, I think the key driver of this type of, not say pessimism or some extent realism, is about fragmentation. We'll have a chance to talk a lot about that in a minute, Sebastian, I know. But the thing is, we are talking about a world with higher import tariffs. We're talking about a world of high fragmentation. We're talking about a world of low efficiency. I always joke, globalization was not because of globalism, it was because of efficiency. So if you are going back a step in which we'll have less globalization, we'll have trade barriers, this means that companies will face higher costs and consumers will face higher prices. So as a result, it's very hard to see growth buoyant these years.
Karen, your outlook.
I think if we start with what Fernando is right about, that we have this globalization, one underlying structural element of that that's really important is that it has created a dependency on the U.S. as the buyer. Right? If you look at net goods importers, the U.S. dominates that. Net goods exporters, China and Germany are the two. And this is what the Trump administration talks about when it talks about the trade imbalance. And that has deleterious effects on the workforces in the United States and the manufacture of goods. And that wrenching attempt at rebalancing is a lot of what we're seeing proposed by the Trump administration. Some policies may or may not work, but that is one of the critical objectives. So that, I think, is creating a lot of uncertainty about how that will unwind. I think the second piece, the more near-term piece, where I hate to be the grumpy economist, but where we're less optimistic about the U.S. outlook, is that it depends on the affluent consumer. That 20% of the U.S. affluent are about a little over half of U.S. consumption, and their number one driver of consumption is equities and the performance of equities. They're very markets driven in their outlook, and the U.S. stock market is larger than, in equities, is larger than the next 10 combined. And so we're talking about global growth and U.S. growth that is very reliant on U.S. affluent consumers, and that because of that market link and because of where valuations are, that creates a fragility that I think is concerning.
Jill.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. Well, we're in line with the findings of the survey. We're above consensus for the US in 25, with some deterioration in 26. I agree with you that things will get a bit more complicated, and below consensus for China and Europe. But I would like to reflect precisely on the fact that the survey is an average between those two very polar situations. And we should reflect on this because most of us were trained in the idea that it's the US which sets the tone of the global cycle. And in a way, what the survey tells us is that we no longer believe it's true. We believe that the US is going to do very, very well, but this is not having any significant traction effect on the other regions. So the big current account deficit country is no longer supporting the rest of the economy. And before we get to the T word and what Mr. Trump may have to do with this, a point which for me is absolutely central is that we should not forget that this divergence, this gap between the US and the other regions, is to some extent an extrapolation of what we've been seeing for many years now. The new US administration has no bearing in the fact that productivity in Europe has been stagnating for years. This is our own doing. The US administration has nothing to do in the fact that China is in the middle of a real estate correction. It has nothing to do with what was coming from DC. So we have these forces which have been shaping the world economy for a number of years. And 2025, obviously, we are tempted to ascribe a lot of what's going to happen in the month ahead to what's going on in DC. But we should also look at ourselves and our own responsibilities in the gap between the US and the rest of the world.
So let's come to the T word. Donald Trump and the US policy are playing a major role here in Davos on almost every panel. So it has to be discussed here as well. The chief economists expect US policy to have a significant impact on the global economy. I think no surprise. 61% believe this will be a long-term shift. I find that striking. What is your expectation, Karen? What will this long-term shift look like?
I think the election of Donald, or the re-election of Donald Trump, it puts us decisively on the road to what we call post-globalization. It's not deglobalization, because actually there's no necessary diminishment in global trade, but the direction is changing. And the best way I can describe it is that we are moving into a more Westphalian world, with the nation state taking preeminence over multinational and multilateral orders. So we see more bilateral agreements. We see trade, again, restructuring in different directions. We've been on a path, the world, by we, I don't mean the United States, I mean we, all of us, have been on a post-global path, I would say, really since 2015 in a decisive way. It's not just Donald Trump, but Xi Jinping's change of policy that have changed that. But this is really, I think, the point at which that reality has set in. And I guess the only flag I would say is that we hear a lot of descriptions that this is a US-China rivalry, and I'm much less convinced about that. I do think it's a multipolar world, and we were discussing collectively van der Leyen's speech yesterday. Europe has the opportunity to create a common capital market and reinvest and be a pole, but my goodness, like, let's get a move on that, right, to be that.
90% of the economists believe the actual tariffs will be smaller in the end than discussed in the election campaigns. How do you see that?
Possibly, depends on the day. The issue I have with the tariffs is that it appears as a sort of Swiss knife for the new US administration. It's not just about rolling back on China or extracting more defense spending from Europe. It's about anything. It's about fentanyl crossing the US border. It's about trying to extract from Europe more purchases of LNG from the US. So it is so pervasive to the entirety of the economic platform of the new US administration that my baseline is that some of it is going to happen. You know, it is there in so many aspects of the entire economic strategy developed by Mr. Trump that honestly some of it will come out. The question for me is, as a European, I'm obviously very, very selfish with that, is how much of this is going to be tailored? How much of this is going to be a sort of generic, uniform tariff on everyone? Because if it's a uniform tariff on everyone, it's kind of okay, because it would mean that the relative competitiveness of, say, European exporters relative to third parties exporters onto the US market would not change. We would simply compete differently with US producers, but very often there is no US producer for what we do.
I would just add that I think of tariffs as a tax on access to the US consumer. Effective or ineffective, that is the purpose of them, and so then it depends on who you want to tax and for what.
So that would be my question. So how does that all fit together? So the US is seeing strong growth. We will see lower taxes, but we will see higher tariffs. So what will happen with inflation?
We were talking about that right before, right, Sebastian? So let me talk about two possible inconsistencies of the outlook. So one is exactly what you just touched upon. So we see higher tariffs, we see less efficiency, we see more fragmented world, maybe post-globalization. How can that feed into easier monetary and fiscal policies? Maybe fiscal policies will be eased, and that will prompt demand, and as a result, probably inflation will pick up. And how can monetary policy be so easy? I'm not talking maybe about Europe, but that's the case of US and Latin American countries. So this is one possible inconsistency that I see. The second one is about AI. I know this is not a panel about AI, but if companies, they realize we are living in a world of more fragmentation, a lot of less efficiency, they will invest more in AI. This will, to some extent, try to circumvent these restrictions and maybe cause some issues, frictions to the job market. And well, and maybe this goes against the promises of the politicians that they will create more jobs with these tariffs. So I see some sort of inconsistencies in this typical outlook. Again, populism has its easy promises, but the economy has its own restrictions. So by the end of the day, I think we'll talk a lot about the risks of inconsistencies of these policies we are talking here in Davos.
But what do you see, Karen, Gilles, for inflation? What is your prediction?
Well, first, I think one of the more important conversations we should be having is around price level, not inflation. That is what the election in the US and the elections in Europe are talking about. Nobody cares that things are only 2.4 or 3% more expensive than they were. They care that for the first time, if we look at groceries, for example, volumes have gone down. People are buying less food. So we can talk about that we've conquered inflation, and that's important.
Good point.
But I do think we need to, and I think the word populism is important. The elite, Davos has been disintermediated in this election, right? We have failed to convince people, we have failed to implement rules in a way that resonate with the majority of voters in a way that feels relevant. And I think, and we can talk about all of these economic indicators, but I think it's really important that we reground in what the population is saying, which is their quality of life, their sense of future, their optimism had collapsed, and they want a disruptive alternative. So there's lots of inconsistencies in this. Tariffs are inflationary, depending on who you deport. Immigration is either, if you deport consumers, it's deflationary, producers, it's inflationary, and there are built-in inherent contradictions. But I think to focus on those details is to miss that big shift.
Gilles, what is your take on that?
I believe in unfortunately, resilient inflation in the US, quite simply because, again, before you're using the T word, the US economy is doing well. Donald Trump won because the majority of American people believe that the US economy is not doing well. Objectively, it is. So we are already in a situation where growth is probably above potential, in a situation where even if the December inflation print was a bit better, inflation remains actually quite resilient. And the risk is that you add to this underlying situation, which is already, I would say, propitious to some resilient inflation, you're going to probably add inflationary policies. So you can have, sort of positive version of Trumpnomics 2.0. The positive version is you do deregulation and you offer very, very cheap energy, and you get lots of investment. For instance, in AI, we got the announcement yesterday. Investment goes up, and the US continues to widen its productivity gap with the rest of the world. Great. But how quickly is it going to trickle down to what is actually at the bedrock of Mr. Trump's electoral support? So the risk is that he still needs to provide some other stuff on which he has been campaigning. Inflationary tariffs and probably an inflationary fiscal policy in total.
Can we quickly stay with this point for a minute, because you, Fernando, also brought it up. Productivity growth is really strong in the United States. Gilles, what can Europe learn from the United States right now?
I think the risk, I think, in Europe is to try to replicate stuff which may not have been that instrumental in the recent acceleration in productivity in the US. We have IRA envy in Europe right now. We look at the IRA, just, no, we need to do that. It's just that we don't really have the money right now. But if you look at what is probably the source of the reacceleration of productivity in the US in the last 10 years, it's actual decentralized decisions by businesses 10 years ago to shift their investment towards R&D and towards software investment. This is what they did 10 years ago. It's probably benefiting now. So one of the things we should remember is that there's something to say about the regulatory burden and this is what something Mrs. von der Leyen talked about in the speech on Tuesday morning. We don't have a lot of money right now. So replicating IRA, I don't think is within our means or even within our political means, but it's stuff which is relatively free is to go harder at offering a better regulatory environment for businesses in Europe.
We'll open up for a Q&A in a minute, so get ready. We will have a microphone so you can add comments or ask questions. We have to talk about fragmentation. We came to that topic already. Many chief economists see a trade war dynamic and an ongoing fragmentation of the economic landscape. 94% of them foresee further fragmentation of goods trade over the next 3 years. Only a smaller majority, 59%, expect the same for service trade. So how will continued fragmentation impact global supply chains, Karen, and what new models of supply chains will we see?
I think we're already seeing the term is resilient supply chains, which just means more expensive supply chains and more of them that companies are investing in. I did want to make one comment.
What trends do you see there?
Sorry, I just did want to say that the U.S. can't afford the IRA either, right? Like the fiscal incontinence has been a big driver of growth, but putting that to the side, we're willing to postpone that debt rather than have debt breaks and rules around it. But again, we're seeing a redirection of trade, but cross-border trade has been flat. It hasn't gone down, and we've seen transshipments rise, who have been the big beneficiaries of the first set of tariffs. It's been the Vietnams, the Mexicos of the world, where access to markets has been pushed out. Do we expect to see that continue? Well, that depends on how effective the Trump administration is in the policy objective of balanced trade, because in a world of balanced trade, Vietnam is number 3 on the list of largest offenders in terms of a current account deficit, and the degree to which that policy gets pushed might change the security of investing in other regions in order to access the U.S. market. So I think that is unclear. The least risky proposition is to get closer to North America, but that is too expensive, right? There just isn't the labor force and the cost base. So that's the tension that companies are wrestling with.
So Fernando, what trends do you see when it comes to resilience in supply chains?
Yeah, so again, it's the second change we are seeing since the pandemic. The pandemic was the big one. Learned a lot about that, about resilience, as Karen was mentioning. Now we have the second one about how to trade, how to deal with these new partners, how to trade under these new tariffs, and how to reorganize our companies. And again, I insist, we will probably see a lot of AI playing a role in defining these things. But there's one interesting aspect of the report that says that services trade are growing much faster than goods trade. Goods trade are doing fine, but services are doing much greater. And again, services prove to us that defining the boundaries is not that simple, because where are you buying cloud? Where are you buying all those data for your AI input? So again, we might be living in a world where politicians believe that putting these trade barriers, they mean a lot, and they are really a fact for goods and for labor. We do not have the chance to talk a lot about labor, but preventing labor migration is very, very damaging to the global economy. But anyway, so we are living in those old days where politicians believe in these boundaries, of physical boundaries. Well, services trade are here to tell, yeah, it's a little bit different this time. So I think there are interesting things in the next few years about services trade.
I do want to run up one flag, because if we do have, what is the knock-on effect of more balanced trade, which won't happen quickly, but it's also less capital accumulation, right? Export-led growth led to big pools of capital, and less global roaming capital means more expensive capital. It means scarcer capital. It's fragmentation in capital markets and higher rates. And I don't hear a lot of discussion about that, but financial services have benefited enormously from this trade imbalance, and that is a place that I think we just don't hear a lot of discussion about.
Maybe there's one quick here, Sebastian. So about red tape, we were having a discussion. Again, it's parallel to this tariff barrier. Maybe one positive, just to keep one, is that by cutting red tape in the US, I saw von der Leyen's speech again saying, well, we need to cut that in Europe, and Jill was saying that right before. So maybe countries will compete to some extent to cut their red tape. And I think this might be a good positive for the global economy, because they will not, you mentioned the financial services, and we benefit a lot from that. So maybe cutting red tape could be a positive outcome of all these new policies.
So I have a very interesting number. Is 2024 survey of US CEOs showed that the proportion of companies with plans to shorten their supply chains had jumped to 81% from 63% in 22. Will reshoring be one of the major trends in the global economy 2025, Gilles?
For me, the biggest trend on this is more wait and see, unfortunately, because rather than the word fragmentation, I prefer the word clubification of the world economy. You know, we have a number of small clubs of countries which get along pretty well and can continue to do business and trade together. The problem is that the clubs we were thinking about, even just a few months ago, are not necessarily the clubs which we will have in 6 months from now. There was a club which for me was obvious, at least seen from Europe, it's North America. There seemed to be quite a nice free trade agreement. Apparently, no, it's more complicated than that. So the idea that you can try to circumvent US protectionism by investing heavily in Mexico and Canada, well, maybe, maybe not. Latin America in general, well, you could actually cut it in two. You've got a part of it which is increasingly driven towards China, a part of it which continues to be driven by North America and Europe, etc., etc., etc. So my biggest fear, actually, for 2025 is that a lot of companies stay a little bit on their hands because you don't know where you want to put your assets.
It's an excellent point. Fernando, will we see a growing global divide?
I think so. Unfortunately, again, I understand when Karen she talks about these post-globalization, but it's hard for me not to think in this global divide. We're seeing that in South America, for example, Argentina versus Brazil. We've seen that in Asia to some extent. We see that in Europe. So I think this is one real risk that we might face. And again, one thing that calls our attention in the report is that why is this happening? Because of geopolitical rivalries. That's true, it's shown on the report, but also because of local choices. And again, this should be respected. These are all democratic countries that are making these choices for populism. But I'm not sure they understand the extent of these choices of more protectionism on their daily lives, as Karen was brilliant putting here. They were concerned about 20% increase in prices, not because inflation is 2%. So this will not go back to the old days of the pre-pandemic. But I love the clubification story, but I just mentioned two ones on the report. First, about fiscal policy trilemma. So countries will have to focus on aging, they'll have to focus on national security, and also on climate change. Fragmentation might affect this trilemma. And we had a new misery index. Misery index is a combination of inflation and unemployment. There might be another one touched on the report, maybe that includes immigration. So these things will be huge discussions moving forward.
Karen, I find that very interesting, you saying the US can't afford the IRA. Will the debt debate start now, or when do you see that happening?
Every side thinks, one side of the aisle always thinks the other side of the aisle spends too much until they get into power, and then it's very justified. The upside is that DOGE actually finds some savings in government, but really, if you want to hear a serious discussion, so in Europe, the serious discussion is a common capital market. In the US, it's entitlement spend. Unless you are having a serious conversation about entitlement spend, you're not having a serious conversation about the fiscal situation, and I haven't heard that. Maybe I haven't been listening hard enough.
But the markets might start the discussion at some point.
They might, right? There's just the bonds, the term premium went up. Is that the bond vigilantes? And I don't know. The markets may start that discussion, but how much of that is just an expectation of longer growth? How much of that is the disinversion of the yield curve? I think it's too easy right now to over-index to very short-term issues until that some politician is willing to say, elect me or don't re-elect me, we have got to tackle what we're spending on Social Security and Medicare, then we're not having a serious discussion.
Yeah, but I think there are early signs on the yield curve. So again, we don't know if it's growth, I don't know if it's risk premium, but for example, we will use it to live in a world of low interest rates and high levels of indebtedness. Some people even came with, sorry for the word, crazy idea of modern monetary theory, talking about you can issue debt unbounded. Wow, we are not living in this world anymore. Maybe the heydays of high indebtedness have come to an end, and you have to talk seriously about not the budgets themselves, but the debt dynamics, and that dynamics include entitlements, includes issues about fragmentation too. So, well, I think fiscal policy will charge its price on markets at some point in time.
We almost have to wrap up. I've one last point. So a very interesting number, and you mentioned that already. In 24, we've seen a new record in trade. Global trade is $33 trillion. Will this be the highest number in a long time? Maybe all of you very quickly. Fernando?
Yeah, I think this is, we are close to a topic there, so probably.
Karen?
Well, China certainly hopes not, right? I mean, their economy is dependent right now on external demand because of their domestic situation. So some of that will depend on, the global south cannot replace the US as a consumer, but certainly that would be a bad outcome for China to see that number shrink.
Gilles?
There's no contradiction between fragmentation and a continuation of the increase in global trade. It's just that you don't trade with the same people. As far as our economies continue to diversify and continues to grow on trend, I would still expect a growth in trade, just not along the same lines.
Let's come to our very quick final round. What would be the most important single piece of advice for policymakers and executives to get ready for 2025 when it comes to global economical risks? Fernando?
Well, maybe I start. Maybe I should say to policymakers, they should prove we economists are wrong. So how can they do that? Just by simply not supporting that much protectionism, by not support those huge increase in tariffs. But truth to be told, my most important concern is about fiscal policy these days. It's not a pending concern, it's not something for the very short term, but I think we'll talk a lot about that in the next few years or so.
Gilles, your recommendation?
Plow your own furrow for policymakers. I mean, the temptation is that we're going to be consumed by the bilateral negotiations with the US, and obviously everyone will need to engage with Washington, D.C., but don't forget to put your own house into order. If there's one message from me, it's really that. China, Europe, there's a lot we need to do domestically, and we can do it even if we get pressure coming from Washington, D.C.
Karen?
When you're thinking about the US, which, as we've, I think, agreed is the center right now of global growth, be careful not to engage in the parable of the elephant, that you assume there's that there's a single policy that's dominating. I think when we look at the Trump administration, we see, yes, balanced and fair trade, also national security and rediversification of the US manufacturing base. Can all of these things happen in 2025? No, none of them will be complete then, but the closer as a company you are to hitting all three of those, the more you need to be thoughtful about how you access that US market.
Fernando, Karen, Gilles, thank you very much for the discussion. Thank you all for coming, and have a great day.